Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to the Herodotus Helpline. It was wonderful last year to take part in the Herodotus Marathon, and I'm really excited to also contribute to the helpline. I need to say, first of all, rabbit, bunny, bunny, and Kalomina, happy first of the month, since this is a paper about something between religion and superstition. I think it's appropriate to start with that. And I also, at the end, we'll have a thanks slide, but I also here at the beginning want to also make my thanks and appreciation expressed formally, first of all, to the Australian Research Council for funding my research into maritime patron gods and maritime and sailors' religion and cults of the ancient Greeks, and to my former master's student, Niall de Young, for her research into Herodotus, and especially to the organizers of the Power of Thetis panel, where this was originally presented at the Celtic Classics Conference at Coimbra, the Four Seas, seas, in Portugal in 2019, which will be eventually a book in which this will appear in a revised format in concert with my student Niall de Young, and also especially thanks to the Australian Research Council, which will be the supporter of the book on the sailors' cults of the ancient Greeks that this research will also figure into. Now, I've juxtaposed here two images from ancient Greece and modern Greece, but both of them concern Thetis and the Nereids, more broadly, the what we might call ancient and modern mermaids, part woman, part sea creature. This is on the left an epinetron from the Eretria painter, and I'll talk more about it in a little while, but you can see in the middle there is Thetis here being carried off, or raped rather, by Peleus here with the permission of Zeus, but much to the consternation of the other Nereids who flee in alarm. And so Thetis, as various myths tell, turned into all sorts of different sea creatures. And this is one of those sea creatures here, which is attacking Peleus and trying to stop this happening. And then on the other hand, we have Miravilis, Stratis Miravilis's novel from the 1930s, the Panagia y Gorgona, a novel of the Virgin Mary as a gorgona or mermaid who can be both a patron of sailors, a helper of sailors, or a vengeful spirit. And I think the really important thing is that whether we're talking about Herodotus's account, about which more soon, or more broadly the idea of women of the sea as objects of cult worship or superstition, or the place where the cult worship and superstition join. Either one, these are female powers who can do great help. They can save your life, literally, or can do great harm if you anger them in the wrong way and are not able to escape from their wrath. Now, from Odysseus in the Odyssey, of course, with Ino's veil, up to the modern Greek folklore collected by people like Miravilis or Patrick Lee Fermer in his book, The Mani. The idea of the water nymph or human of partly female, partly fishy form has been a constant of both Greek mythology and vase painting and art. But also, I would argue that it has been a constant of religion of the Greeks too, from the archaic and classical Greece of Herodotus through to the modern Greece of Patrick Lee Fermer or Miravilis. There were these stories circulating in oral form, but we can find evidence of these stories in historical works like Herodotus, and we can find evidence of them in the works also of artists, and particularly the votives that were deposited in sanctuaries that show the actual physical remnants of the devotional practices of Greek sailors. The famous, most famous myth of Thetis, of course, is her abduction by Peleus, her marriage, and then her bearing of the son who will be greater than his father, Achilles, who also goes on to be a hero and a potential patron of sailors himself. And then on the other side of things in the modern world, we have the gorgons, the gorgones of modern Greek superstition around mermaids, who are strangely obsessed with Alexander the Great, Megalexandros, and ask, at least according to a number of different novels and collections of seafarers' tales and Greek folk tales, where is Megalexandros? To which the sailor must reply, Alexander lives and rules, and he keeps the world at peace. Then Galini, calm, will fall over the waters, and the mermaid will let you go on your way. So, as I mentioned, there are great continuities from Herodotus's day to the modern world. And Thetis and the Nereids are just one little corner of my larger project, my book project, on the risk, ritual protection, and patrons of travel by sea in ancient to Roman era classical Greece. And these are just some examples from the modern religious landscape, the landscape of modern shipping and also of ancient artifacts. And we have to put these two things together, the world of geography and the sea and the world that we all actually live in and inhabit. And we have to put that together with the artifacts and texts of ancient Greece in order to restore some idea of how religion actually was practiced in the ancient world. What was the religious landscape that was created by the coming and going of Greek sailors? By their rituals done ashore and aboard ship, of risk management, and in the course of fishing, of trading, of colonizing, of migrating permanently, or of engaging in mercantile trade, and in fact in warfare, right, with the larger warships, leading to widespread votives deposited in sacred places, and also to widespread common habits of shipbuilding and of sacralization of the ship. Greek sailors shaped this coastal religious landscape from the Western Mediterranean of Sanctuary of Hercules at Gibraltar, as far as the eastern coasts and northern coasts of the Black Sea, about which more later in the paper. This is a maritime network that was continuously developing as the sailors came and went in their ships. It incorporated myriad local cults and changed Greek religion in return, but it was always shaped by the actual natural world, right? The prevailing winds, especially the Etesian winds of the summertime in the Mediterranean coming from the north, and the more fluky winds of the winter, the kind of winds that still have the capacity to deposit modern shipping, such as this Russian bulk carrier of iron ore, which rests on this rock next to the island of Kythera, actually up to today. I think it went ashore sometime in the 90s, according to the oral tradition of the people of Kythera, the Kytherians. It was also shaped by particular benefits of Mediterranean seafaring as well, though. not just the predictability of the summer winds, but also the frequent calms, the very few currents, except of course the Evripos or Europos and some other small currents like that. For the most part, you have very few currents in the Mediterranean and very little tide as well. So the kind of tidal tradition or tidal circumstances of southern England or of America, Cape Cod, where I grew up, those sorts of tides are really unknown in the Mediterranean. So you can beach your ship on the sand and leave it there, and it will still be there for the most part when you come back again, or when you wake up in the morning, say, if you sleep ashore on the beach. So with this natural world of risk, you had also ships that needed to have the ritual protection that you could give to them, as well as the knowledge of the sailors themselves. So the kind of ritual protection that was customarily given to shipping had to do with, first of all, eyes on the ship bow, which you can see here in this rebuilt Kyrenia ship. This is a 4th century BC merchantman that sank off of the Kyrenia in Cyprus in the 4th century BC and was rebuilt in the 1980s and then again in the 1990s. So you've got things like the eyes on the bow. You might also have figureheads, such as here on the sarcophagus of Captain Evdimos, who passed away in the 4th or 3rd century BC in Olympos in southern Lycia, what's now southern Turkey. And he had placed his ship, at least from the evidence of the relief carving, under the protection of this half-nude patron goddess or Nereid or nymph or sprite of some sort. And then on the other end, at the stern, Evdimos didn't have anything particularly dramatic or so that we can see here, but we can look to things like this red figure vase fragment, which comes from the Acropolis in Athens, where a goddess is holding 2 aphlasta, or stern ornaments that had been cut off and are in the process of being dedicated in thanks for a successful naval victory, most likely. And these are female stern heads, so not figureheads, but stern heads of the Aphlaston, which are said to have come from Phoenician ships seized either at Artemisium or at the Battle of Salamis, and depicted in the era of the 460s BC by a painter who was called the Boreas painter for his predilection, his or her predilection for painting in red figure the wind god of the north, Boreas. All right, so what does Herodotus have to do with all of this? This is the Herodotus Helpline, after all. And so I want to bring in Herodotus, particularly for his evidence that he offers us about Thetis in particular, and the Nereids more broadly, as patrons of Ionian sailors in the 5th century BC. Now, Herodotus narrates several storms which pruned down the Persian fleet of Xerxes as it headed west in the spring of what we call 480 BC, from Athos, where Xerxes avoided the storm and wreck that had affected his father Darius's fleet by building this famous canal at Oronopoli between the Acti of Mount Athos and the Chalkidiki. There he avoided wreck, but after he left Thermae, modern Thessaloniki, and started down the coast, there was the first big storm, and then after Artemisium, there was a second big storm as well here on this map. Now, each of these storms, according to Herodotus, wrecked hundreds of ships, and hence also must have resulted in the loss of provisions and the lives of many of the men aboard them. The first storm happened when the Persian fleet was caught on the lee shore of Thessaly, somewhere along here, what's Magnesia now, Mount Pelion, still a place of a great deal of storms. And even though they were an anchor, they were 8 ships deep because there were so many ships, right? 1,407 or something like that. This Persian fleet was caught on the lee shore between the small ancient cities of Meliboea and Castanea, and near the coastal rocks called the Ipni, the ovens or lanterns, which are here on the north side of Skiathos. And they were driven ashore during this first big storm. They were driven ashore on the Sepiad headland, Cape Sepias here. And this is a view of that headland from the sea, from Cape Artemision here, looking across, looking north. This is the beach. And that's the Sepiad headland, which was named Iacti I Sepias, after its resemblance to a cuttlefish, shown here, smaller than actual size. And a cuttlefish is what this outline of the bay, rather the cape, looks like from the sea, but it's also sort of what it looks like a little bit from the air too. Now, Greeks didn't have a view from the air, but they imagined a lot of things, how they did look from the air. For example, Alexandria was said to look like a chlamys, a cloak spread out. So I think in the naming of this headland, we should think about the sailor on the ship looking at the outline. And we should also think about, what it was imagined to look like coming down in a curling cape, a very protective place for the native Thessalians, but a damaging, open sea, dangerous spot for the Persians who were washed ashore there. So let's say, what does Herodotus say about this particular place in that winter storm, well, not yet winter storm, unusual summer storm of 480 BC. 187 says that at dawn, the Persian fleet was caught there in heavy blow from the east. That sort of wind, which is called Hellespontine, Calusi, and it raised up a confused sea like a pot on a boil. So it made the ocean boil when the wind blew from the Hellespont. So when the wind blew from the north or from the east, or really from the northeast, right, from the direction of the Hellespont. Those who realized that it was coming beached their vessels and saved their lives, but the ships which were caught offshore were all lost, some driven to the place called the ovens. This is the Ipni, the ovens of the lanterns, at the foot of Mount Pelion, and others onto the beach itself, and others were smashed off of Meliboea and Castanea. 400 ships at the lowest estimate, says Herodotus. We wonder where he got these estimates. That were lost, right, in this winter storm, a himonos crema, right, which was translated here as very violent, but it's something more like a disaster of the winter, even though this was during the summer. So it was very unusual that this sort of wind would blow and that this kind of a disaster would come up, right? So it kept going too. It didn't end right away, but Herodotus continues at 191 that it went on for 3 days. And the telos, right, the ending of this was finally from the Magi, right? The Magi who were making offerings, making sacrificial offerings, and they were also putting spells on the wind, katidontes goesi, suppose making prayers from the perspective of the Greeks, but this is a word that's used a lot for the magi and later on for magic practitioners, sorcerers, witches, and wizards, right? And also, so besides these two things, which are fairly traditional, conventional parts of Persian religion, the third thing was that they were also addressing specifically Thetis and the Nereids, right, with sacrifices. Further offerings, further sacrifices, right, to Thetis and the Nereids, perhaps libations, perhaps blood sacrifices, perhaps other things. Anyway, on the fourth day, the wind stopped, and I think this is really the crux of this passage of Herodotus, and the thing that I'm going to consider in more detail is that, first of all, Herodotus is as oftentimes in his histories, straddling two worlds, right? The world of religion and belief, and the idea that sacrifices are efficacious and useful and can result in the control of human beings over gods, goddesses, and natural forces. And the other world of skepticism, of philosophy, of a kind of scientific idea about the way that the world works. And he has the foot in both camps, and he offers this perhaps for himself, perhaps for his readers, perhaps both. Also, we might think about his listeners, right? That on the one hand, it may be that this was the result of these things that the Magi were doing, or he says, I alos kos autos athelon ekopase, right? That it may be that the wind just dropped off somehow naturally, right? It just stopped blowing because that's what the wind does, right? And that's a really interesting aspect of this passage. And the other interesting aspect of this passage that I want to go on to in greater detail is that in particular, the Magi sacrificed to Thetis after inquiry, right? Puthomenoi paraton ionon ton logon. They, according to Herodotus, had inquired and learned through inquiry a logos, a story, an etiology maybe as well, we could call it, from the Ionians. That would be the Ionians with the Persian fleet, not the Thessalians of the area, but the Ionians in the Persian fleet, the men of the coast, of the cities of Ionia and the islands. They had identified this place, Pelion, Cape Sepias, as the place where she was carried off. We sometimes translate this raped, but anyway, forcibly married in these many different forms by Peleus. And that all of the area, all of Hiakti, Sepias, was sacred to her and her sisters, the Nereids, the daughters of Nereus, the old man of the sea, as she was. And these Nereids, by the time of Herodotus and also by the time of the Ionians, who are meant to be the source of this logos, all of these are the Nereids who have been patrons of sailors for generations, certainly as far back as the archaic and early epic poetry of Hesiod or Homer. I have a line from Hesiod here, translated by Barbara Kowalczyk, that the Nereids still with ease the waves on the misty sea and the gusts of the strong blowing winds. So they are already patrons of sailors, and that is why they are asked to assist first by the Ionians and then by the Magi who are leading the kind of religious process of address in this time back in 480 BC. Right. Thus Herodotus wrote of the somewhat Homeric fate of 400 of the some 1,200 Persian-led warships and penteconters, which he claims had sailed south from Thermae or Thessaloniki today in the spring of 480 BC. Now there must have, of course, been ships wrecked, but there must also have been enough ships to survive this storm, first of all, to contest the ensuing sea battle at Artemision, and later for there to be 200, according to Herodotus, ships that were wrecked rounding the hollows of Euboea in another unseasonal summer storm. And finally, there must be enough ships left to contest the Battle of Salamis and have enough ships to retreat north and take Xerxes and many others back to their homes, either in Ionia or somewhere else further east. Now, Herodotus spreads credit very widely for these storms when accounting for traditions beyond the Ionian advice to the Magi. He has to, of course, account for the traditions of his own era and the different reactions to these storms that the Greeks themselves had, both at the time and a bit later. And he says in the subsequent account of this particular episode that the people of Delphi had spread the news to all the Greeks about an oracle that they should pray to the winds, for these would be great allies of Hellas, and that the people of Delphi at least had established an altar to the winds at Thuia, which was a town of Phocis, the town dedicated to that particular wind nymph or whirlwind nymph, daughter of the river Kephissos, just below Delphi to the east, ancient Carii. And Herodotus says at 178 that the people of Delphi continue to pray there up to my own day. Now the particular goddess Thuia or nymph Thuia and the Theades, the whirlwind goddesses that she belonged to, had a long history at Delphi. They were depicted on the west pediment of the temple, the archaic temple, and also later the classical temple as well, as the nymphs in the entourage of Dionysus who hold Delphi in the wintertime, and then are placated in the springtime and turn over the control of the sanctuary to Apollo and Artemis for the summer. There was, however, a rival oracle to the Delphic oracle. There was an oracle that the Athenians had to seek the assistance of their father-in-law or son-in-law. The wind god Boreas was what the Athenians made of that particular oracle. And they prayed to the northeast wind Boreas as abductor and husband of their own mountain wind nymph, the local Athenian wind nymph Orithwia, or mountain wind nymph. And that is a red figure representation of Boreas raping or carrying off her in the effort to capture her power. And he's supposed to have carried her off from the banks of the Ilissos River in Athens, where Plato says that there was a shrine still in the 4th century BC for both Orithwia and Boreas. And the Athenians had built the shrine in thanks to him for his assistance during the Persian wars at sea. And he was interpreted as their father-in-law, as he was carrying off Orothea, and she was interpreted as a daughter of Erechtheus, the Athenian sort of founding father hero. So therefore, he was Boreas as their father-in-law. Now, the vast majority of Greeks at the time, however, did not go with the Delphic or with the Athenian reaction to this particular storm. Herodotus continues on at 7-192 to say that the allied Greek navy, those Athenians, Spartans, Corinthians, and others under the command of the Spartan commander, quote, offered prayers and libations of wine to Poseidon, their savior, and made all speed to return to Artemision, and from that day to this have always addressed Poseidon by the title of savior, or soter. And in fact, Poseidon as savior at sea was established not just at Chalcis, where this statue of him came out of the Europos, but was also established all over Greece, at Corinth, at Athens, and at the other cities that those naval men went back to. And then finally, after the encounter between the Persian navy and this allied Greek navy at Cape Artemision, and the indecisive sea battle there, which was still claimed as a victory by Athens, Artemis of the Dawn, or the East, her title at the northeastern end of Euboea at Artemision, she was credited with assistance, and she was honored with standing stones, stelae, a small temple, and also votive dedications, which are most extensively described in Plutarch's Life of Themistocles. There was a grove of trees, he said, growing right around the temple, and a ring of upright stelae of a certain kind of white stone, which when touched gives the smell as well as the color of crocus or saffron. I have no idea what that is. We're really interested to hear what your thoughts are. There was one stele that had an elegiac poem inscribed on it, which detailed the Athenian victory over men from the land of Asia and their gratitude to Artemis, pros Oia, Artemis towards the east and towards the dawn, recorded in a 4-line hexameter poem. So many of the Greeks outside of the Ionians, they looked to Poseidon, to wind nymphs, or to Artemis to thank properly for their surviving the storm, and also for whatever actually happened at the Battle of Artemision, which I think is probably not able to be very easily reconstructed today. The Ionians, however, the Ionians were onto something in claiming that Thetis and the Nereids were special patrons of sailors and guardians of this cape, Cape Sepios, Cape Cuttlefish, for it is not only in Ionian tradition that we find Thetis and the Nereids invoked by sailors, but also in the traditions of Thessaly and of the Thessalians themselves in the 4th century BC. There was the legend, of course, yes, the hexameter poem you can find in Plutarch's Life of Themistocles, chapter 8, and that's where it is quoted. Yeah. So in Thessaly, however, in Thessaly, we have to go by some of the excavations and some of the literary sources that together let us know that Thetis and the Nereids were important there. There was, of course, the very commonly known story of the Argonauts, Jason, who are supposed to have stopped at somewhere called Aphatai, which is where the Persians had also anchored in the end after the storm. And that's been identified as this cove of Platanias, although there are other possibilities along the outside of the cape. And then inside, there were the anchorages, which are up here at the top of the bay at modern Volos, probably ancient Pagasai, and Iolcus before that. And down here at Demetrias, which was also one of these ancient cities. So we know that there was Artemis Iolkia and Apollo Pagaseos. They're both mentioned in the Shield of Heracles of Hesiod, lines 58 to 71. And there's been excavation of a Soros or mound, which contains ruins of a temple, probably for Apollo, but not entirely clear. Perhaps the oddest aspect of devotion to Thetis, who is a Nereid, right, a sea goddess, a mermaid, as it were, is that in riverine Pharsalus, which is most famous as the site of the later battle between Pompey and Caesar, and is actually off this map because it's so far inland, but it is on a river. On that river of Pharsalus that does flow eventually into the Peneus and into the sea, there was, at least from the 5th century BC, and maybe even older than that, a Thetidion, the only solely devoted sanctuary of Thetis that is known from the ancient world, where she was not sharing it with anyone else. It was her temple, a place with a statue and a galma and a bomos, an altar, according to Euripides' play Andromache, which is set there. And it was strangely inland, but it was her place, the place where she traveled, back and forth to the sea in her supernatural way, where Peleus could have peace and eventually be laid to rest. And it was at the center of a whole lot of mythical traditions around the aftermath of the Trojan War, which Euripides staged in his play Andromache. So it is kind of quite interesting that she was clearly actually present in the area of Thessaly, in the Magnesian peninsula of Mount Pelion, alongside such more familiar Thessalian heroes as Achilles, the son of Thetis and Peleus, or Chiron the centaur, or the Jason and the Argonauts for that matter. But what about back in Ionia? I thank Diana Burton for this fantastic map of devotion to Achilles, the son of Thetis, in the ancient world. And you can see that he was particularly popular on the coast of Ionia and at Ionian colonies. But he was also an object of devotion, not so surprisingly, at Sparta and also on the west coast of Achaia, actually in the kind of borderland between Arcadia and Achaia. And even all the way up here at the north end of the Black Sea, there was devotion to Thetis alongside her son Achilles. And I want to finish with this example, which has recently become much more well known than it ever was when I first started this research. That is the tiny island of Lefki or Luke, this little tiny island here, which is now today known all over the world as Snake Island. The place taken by the Russians and then retaken by the Ukrainians in the course of last year's war, which is ongoing. There were dedications by Ionians, both colonists and traders and travelers and poets, a wide range of Ionians who had settled at Olbia, here at the mouth of the great river system that leads eventually into this northwest area of the Black Sea called the Racecourse of Achilles, because it was here on the island of Lefki at the mouth of both the northern rivers and the great delta of the Danube, that on this tiny island, Achilles was said to dwell and hence dwell together as Pontarchis with Thetis, his mother. This is referenced in Euripides' Andromache, and it's also actually referenced even earlier in poetry of the 4th, 5th, and 6th century BC. So it's a very old devotion of sailors to Thetis and her son Achilles, and also to Helen as his mythological wife on the island. But this was not just in myth or in drama. It was also the place of devotions and dedications in the 5th century BC, in the era of Herodotus's writing and even of the era of the Persian invasions. There was a small temple, the ruins of which were excavated by the French, and there was in the cove, the sort of only good place to dock or land on the island. Over here, there are a whole series of these anchor stocks and anchor collars, which show that sailors were anchoring here. And on the land, in and around the temple, there are dedications, including black figure and red figure vases dedicated to Achilles and to Thetis, his mother, as well as to Helen and other Homeric heroes and heroines. These sailors of the Ionians and of the wider group of Greek sailors, they attached these Trojan War legends that were in Thessaly, that were on the coast of Ionia, all the way to the north, to the island of Lefki, and all the way to the south in the port of Sparta, Githio, where you can still today see the island of Cranae, which Pausanias in the 2nd century said had a sanctuary of Aphrodite Megonitis, Aphrodite of sexual intercourse or of exchange of bodily fluids, but also exchange of goods and services of all sorts. This sanctuary, in the time of Pausanias at least, was attributed to foundation by Alexander, that's probably Paris, and was also said to be host to an image of Thetis and images of the Praxidikae, the goddesses who do just things, right, associated with Thetis. So it must have seemed very old to Pausanias in the 2nd century CE, maybe even going back to, again, the 5th or 6th century BC, and thought to be connected with the Homeric heroes. And just around the Cape of the Mani Peninsula, there you will find Patrick Lee Fermer's house, which was donated to the Benaki Museum when he passed away and can still be used for writing and research today. And there you will also find in antiquity an enclosure for the Nereids, a place where they supposedly came up out of the sea for the last time to catch a glimpse of Achilles' son Pyrrhus on his way to Sparta to marry Hermione, the daughter of Helen, who was more beautiful than Aphrodite, says Homer in the Odyssey. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak to the helpline. Thanks very much to Nalda Young for her research on Herodotus and cooperation and work together on this particular paper. Thanks to Diana Burton for the map, and thanks to the Power of Thetis panel organizers. May you only meet with friendly mermaids in your travels.